Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode in 2025 for Relating to DevSecOps. I'm your host, Ken Toller, and I'm joined again by Mike McCabe, and we are diving into all things that we're going to accomplish in 2025 this year, from start to finish. Mike, we're getting into New Year's resolutions this year, as we do every year, and we're on like day 20 ish of our resolutions, security resolutions, and just want to see how you're doing on your tasks, on your new security initiatives.
That's a great question. Security initiative, dry January. That resolution has not been kept so far. But there's always February and January of next year too.
Is this just like your typical dry January, or is this a security specific dry January?
No hack
Like,
January.
oh,
That
no
that's not
hacks
happening.
January. Oh,
That's
I
not
see.
happening, is it?
I
No.
see. Yeah, no,
No.
we're way past that.
Yeah.
There have been so many. Yeah.
Yeah.
It started well in like December, and it hasn't stopped really. So, yeah, we're not doing too well there.
No.
But if security January is dry, then people can successfully have dry January.
Yes, that's true. Which will probably never happen either. So
Yeah.
sad.
Um, yeah. Other than that, what about like what about resolutions, like positive resolutions, where
Yeah.
things you're bringing to the security world in 2025? Any new talks, new rule sets, new frameworks, new ideas?
Yeah, doing some training in Mexico in about a month at Hack GDL. So that'll be fun. That'll be on Terraform because I'm a broken record and talk about that all the time. But that'll be cool, teaching some of the stuff that you and me have talked about quite a few times. Otherwise, don't have too many speaking slots coming up. What about you?
Nothing approved yet. Nothing accepted or approved yet. But I'm hoping to get a talk accepted around like getting back to simple solutions for some of these problems. You know, we've seen a lot of these new frameworks and implementations and reinventing of the wheel, and I found a lot of success in trying to look at simplifying things over the last year, and I want to bring more of that into 2025. So have a talk about that. That we'll see if it gets picked up. I don't know.
Nice. Yeah,
I don't
good
know.
luck.
Appreciate that.
On that note, January also means ShmooCon, which just happened, and it was the last one.
Yeah.
And
Last ShmooCon, end of
you
an era.
f- you flew on the private jet down here from New York to go to it. So what we got to hear your debrief on the last ShmooCon.
Yeah, the private jet of 4 hours of traffic. That's about.
That's a middle class private jet, you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, ShmooCon was fun. I'm glad I got to attend the final one. There was a lot of there was a lot of history shared. It was good to hear from the founders, and how things have grown, and their whole family is involved. Bruce and Heidi's family are involved. I don't know them personally, but it was just cool to see how it had evolved over the years, and into what it was. And really sad to see it go, because ShmooCon was one of those conferences where it was that you had the whole ticket thing. Everybody's trying to get a ticket, and it was only a couple thousand attendees in the Washington Hilton, and I think it was small enough and never got big enough to feel like you were overwhelmed inside of the conference. But the quality of the talks is always pretty good, and the LobbyCon's always pretty good, and they've got good activities and villages and things for all ages, and it was a good one. And I think that especially this year, a lot of the talks were good. I really got a lot out of it this time, and I think part of that was just forcing myself to, like, I want to be a part of this last one, and to get as much out of it as I could. But it was definitely worth it to go, and see that. So
That's cool.
yeah, it was really, really cool.
Yeah, it is a very, or I guess was, I'll say, very unique conference compared to a lot of them. Definitely has that like hacker vibe, hacker ethos. I mean, security's gotten pretty commercial in a lot of places, and a lot of conferences feel commercial. Even the OG hacker conferences like DEF CON still feel way more commercial, but ShmooCon never really had that feel to it. It always felt like just a group of hackers, and DC has a lot of security folks that live and work around here, so it's always a pretty lively group and pretty passionate about the topics. And I think there's quite a few interesting topics that got spoken about this year, which is always kind of cool. It's not always the same thing year after year. What was your favorite topic? We'll start with.
Yeah, I think I have a favorite topic, which there was a lot of. I I this has nothing to do with DevSecOps, but just like um, the radio hacking sort of theme is always alive and well at ShmooCon, and they have the radio CTF, and so it's always I've always been really interested in it. But in the last couple of years, I've done more research around radio and radio hacking and all that kind of stuff, and so I had sort of a better head on my shoulders to consume that information. So it was nice to actually see it and have like some understanding of it. And so there were a lot of talks around radio and things you can do and projects you can get involved with. And, the hardware side has always fascinated me. But I think the one that I appreciated the most, or at least the most applicable talk was Grifter and Pope did so they run like the knock at DEF CON, and they had when they'd gone through a talk of like everything that you need to stand up a SOC, in their opinion, like all the functions that you need, and they sort of stepped through each of those themes or those capabilities of a SOC, and then gave you like, here are the things you need to do with this, and here are the top 3 that we think in the industry right now are that you can pay for, and here are the top 3 open source sort of free roll your own tools as well. And they had that for every category, which I thought was really great, because for me, I'm constantly looking for open source projects, but I'm always sort of overwhelmed with, is this actually a good project? How much time am I going to have to spend to even figure out if this is viable in an environment? And then what am I going to test that on? And so it's just like there's a lift of maybe there's 50 different projects that do a similar thing. Now you have a smaller list and you can go investigate that kind of thing. And so I learned about some things I didn't even know about just because I'm not plugged into that world. And it was nice to be able to explore those and be like, okay, and talk to them about it afterwards, and see that the open source community is still alive and well, and that there are enterprise level products and projects that I think have this either completely open source ethos, or they are open source with a hosted option. And it was good to see that. It made me start to think about how we can do that for like the application security world or the AppSec integration world. So that was the most valuable, because it allowed me to sort of look at like just a different style. Like nobody usually does that. They talk about how to integrate these different enterprise tools, and we talk about how expensive Splunk is, but it's very rare that you get a side by side for like 15 different categories of capabilities of open source and enterprise tooling in one talk. And so I thought that was like super valuable for me to see.
Yeah.
So those are my two favorites. Like the radio stuff, they had, cell tower, interception. They had, tracking planes in the sky with security and surveillance cameras. They had, all kinds of interesting things that people are doing just with radio and software. And I think the coolest part of that is just how cheap hardware to get into that world has been, if you're curious about it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not our typical DevSecOps topic, but it was really fun to jump into and see those talks.
What part of the DevSecOps pipeline is radio hacking? I finally got that out.
Yeah, what is it?
That'd be pretty early on because you're hacking the hardware,
Well, it's also interesting because like there are this blend of software and hardware is really interesting. Like, so we talked about this on a previous episode, but there's been like this ITOT. There's a security industry around ITOT, and then there is DevSecOps. And I had mentioned before that one of the things that when I was looking at ITOT as a practice, I always had trouble getting over the hurdle of like what makes this different from application security. You're talking about deploying software, you're deploying it to an endpoint, it is an application that is running, it is doing things, it has attacks on the network from it that are, application specific attacks. There is a software development lifecycle for these things. It gets pushed to the device. It's not necessarily firmware. So like, what is different about this? And the difference, I think, is two things. One, the compliance stuff that we had talked about before, and also like what you have access to and what these applications are actually doing. They are, they're interacting with different sensors, they are interacting with radio, they're interacting with other technologies that, are different than, your web application or your desktop application or your software application. And it's also different than your hardware, your computer running on Linux or running on Windows or whatever it is. So I think that in that respect, having knowledge of hardware and radio, I think it does come into play because you're looking at software that interacts with these physical elements of a device.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's pretty interesting. On the I was going to go back to the open source versus commercial thing you talked about. It's always awesome when someone who's like, the hardest part I think when you're like choosing solution or trying to solve something with a tool is not knowing what's good and what's bad out there. I mean, obviously, like you said, you can go spend $1 million on Splunk a year, or you can try to hack together a bunch of solutions. So it's always nice when someone like drops the knowledge and they put in the time to figure out what solution's actually good, and that there actually is an open source solution that works pretty well. That's pretty nice. So those are always good talks. Just, you would think every talk is just dropping some serious knowledge, but occasionally you get those like real gems of talks that you can tell someone has spent way too much time doing that thing.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about the talk is it's fun to watch the talks about somebody, finding a 0-day or doing this cool project and watching them sort of go through their journey and talk about where they ended up. But I think the end, like your interaction with those talks a lot of the time is, oh, I'll go look at this project and then I'll mess around with it and maybe I'll buy some hardware and I'll play with it. But you don't really maybe you become a contributor to that project, but I would say the vast majority of people probably don't, right? The nice thing about this talk is that the output was like, I can use something from every section of this talk and I can take it back to my personal life. I can now potentially manage my devices with an open source MDM if I wanted to, and I could play with it there. Or I can offer a solution that maybe I've been struggling with. You don't have a security budget to implement, SOAR. So maybe you can explore some of these other tools that are open source to try and get the proof of concept out that you want, or you can, roll it out as an open source project.
Yeah.
So that's I really appreciated that. Is that like I actually had a takeaway I could use.
Yeah. Did you participate in LobbyCon? And how was LobbyCon this year? And for anyone who hasn't been to ShmooCon, I don't know if they invented it necessarily, but I would say it has one of the strongest LobbyCons, as in people just
Yeah.
hanging out in the lobby. And there's a bar, so people hang out and have drinks and just sit there and chat. And it's going 24/7 at ShmooCon.
Yeah, I mean, it was constantly packed. I always wonder about who, like, if people were at the Hilton and not knowing that it was like this kind of like what they would be thinking,
Yeah.
because I mean, it's just, I love it because there's a lot of people come from like all different walks of life there, and it's just a great place to meet new people that you probably wouldn't meet otherwise unless it's at a security conference. And yeah, it does have a really strong LobbyCon. I know some folks didn't even go to a talk, and that's their MO at ShmooCon. Yeah, definitely a strong LobbyCon as usual this year. I wasn't a time that I was in the lobby that it wasn't packed, the bar wasn't packed, and that goes for morning to night, for better or for worse.
Yeah. I mean, there are people who fly in just to go to LobbyCon. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a pretty big one. It sounds like you also saw something about kind of the cost of breaches, which I know we talked about that IBM report quite a few episodes ago, but I thought it was interesting that you had a topic that's sort of related to that. So can you tell me about what that talk kind of covered?
Yeah, it was a pretty short one, but it did help because the person Amanda Drager was she talked about it from the perspective of a person that helps the underwriters for insurance determine like the risk of an incident based on like her technical expertise around the incident. And so her perspective was very much how engineers or how like the technical risk that we're talking about turns to dollars and how underwriters and insurance view that when they are determining the cost of a breach and what premiums to give to a particular company. So, and that was that is the cyber risk engineer is the job title that she was talking about. So I found that really interesting because we do talk. I mean, we've talked about it on the podcast before. Is like how do you show monetary value or financial risk to something that you haven't quantified? Um, and some of the stats that she brought out as part of this was like, you know, even just sending a physical mail to someone is, you can count on that being $1 per record. So if you have 10 million people, you're starting at $10 million at just to notify people. So if you're thinking about your cyber insurance premium, and I know that I've worked with companies that have over 10 million records and have premiums that are, 2 million or $5 million for a cyber incident, you could blow your budget just on that, right? Of coverage. So I think it's interesting to like have somebody that is doing that every day and talking to people and hearing these numbers come back is like a really good perspective to have. And that was one of the first talks like of the first day. And yeah, I would highly recommend. I mean, it's super short. When they get posted, I would definitely look at that because it's easy to hear content and it's something that I think we need to be reminded of, and it'll give you ideas about how to look at quantifying things for risk. The other like sort of I guess takeaway that I got from that is that it doesn't necessarily have to be one of the things we talk about when we're calculating risk of like a data record is sometimes we say we're trying to look at like the complete picture. So, if you're like, hey, data analyst, we have how many records do we have in the database? And they're like, I don't know. Like we have a billion records, but I don't know how many of those are PII. If you can just say at least this much, or you can say, or try to find like a minimum value of those records, you can still present the case of we don't know how much this is going to cost, but we do know that it would cost us at least this much if X percentage of this database were breached. So it's like trying to get away from that completionist mentality, especially if your data is not all there. And she calls that as well. Like data is hard. And not every, like how many people, it's like raise your hand if you have all of your data classified and inventoried, and like nobody in the audience.
Yeah.
And you just realize, okay, all these problems that I'm going through in terms of data classification, data inventory, completion, and comprehensiveness of that data inventory is hard, and other people are going through it, and everyone has the skeletons buried, and it sucks because I think we have this mentality of like, hey, all these organizations are SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, so they must have a data inventory and it must be complete, when that's not reality.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. I mean, we talked about quantifying like risk and loss when it comes to cyber issues before, but I do think insurance is super interesting in the sense of their job is to figure out, monetary value and the risk, the risk behind insuring something. So I feel like in the technical security world, we spend so much time talking about risk from high, medium, low, but we don't go to like, this is going to cost X amount of dollars to recover from. So yeah, it's always interesting seeing that view because insurance companies are the OG risk people trying to figure out what's worth insuring and not to insure. And so
Yeah.
that's pretty interesting. But also a good argument, kind of like that IBM report we talked about before of like, there's a legit, pretty high, even if you're small, monetary value to having a breach. So yeah, spend 10 million on your security program, spend a tenth of that on your security program, or spend 10 million sending pieces of paper out to all your customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the conversation's a bit different, right? It's like you're talking about um, you're talking about a known and tangible cost of if this happens, you will spend this much. And so everyone thinks, oh, it won't happen to me, so I'm not gonna have to spend that money. And then you have the other side of it of like, well, if you spend $10 million in your on your security program, you won't spend this $10 million in the breach. But that's not actually the case, right? Because you could
Mhm.
spend $10 million in your security program and still go through a breach.
Yeah.
And I think that's that's more of the conversation. So I think that if we can start to get to doing these things will reduce your insurance premium for this much coverage because it tangibly reduces risk is a more interesting conversation to a CFO.
Yeah. True.
Right? So it's like hey, if you spend X amount of dollars here, it'll reduce your premium by this much. And maybe we should be talking to insurance providers in that way, just as it, not to say that this replaces risk discussions, but it's a strategy to get more security budget for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. If only people took potential risk seriously as budget risk. But yeah,
Yeah.
businesses are businesses.
Yeah. I mean, and we say it all the time. Like it at the end of the day, the people that you are talking to are not hearing security problems; they're hearing money problems, and you have to meet them in that respect, right? You have to get to that meet
Yeah.
to realize the risk, unless you have a breach, right? And then it's like the purse strings open up, and people realize, okay, well, or if there's a breach in your industry, I think that's the other thing. People get
Yeah.
scared and I hate operating from a place of fear, but it is a powerful motivator.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, running a business is all about risk too. So people should be aware of what the real risk is. Um, Probably won't have time to get into it today, but do want to talk about OpenGrep at some a certain point because that's going to be playing to the DevSecOps world when we're talking about open versus closed source. But topic for a different day, maybe the next episode.
Well, I mean, I think we could probably cover it in the next episode, but I think we should start the conversation of like, I would love to do a light version of that SOC talk with some of the tools that we interact with. Like, let's talk about SAST and DAST and vulnerability management and risk management and framework tracking and all these things that we've sort of been collecting, um, and do that list of like what does it take to have what tools do you need in a basic or even intermediate application security program, um, to execute successfully. And I think people might scoff at that and be like, security is not about the tools and blah. And I'm like, yeah, but you're still going to use them, right? So it's helpful to have a list of best in breed in our opinion, pros and cons, and then why, and then open source alternatives to that. And I mean, if you want to talk a little bit about OpenGrep, it's super. I find it so interesting how, like, why this is coming about, right? Because
Hmm.
we've all been so in love with Semgrep, or at least a lot of us. I don't know if all of us have, for such a long time. And now it's like it's going sort of the way of HashiCorp and Terraform, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
same thing. We love Terraform and it was open source. What was it? Open source?
Yeah, it was open
Yeah.
source.
And then it started making some money, right? And money talks, and now we're in a position where, well, maybe it's not completely open source. You got to pay for some premium features, or and
Yeah.
it's like and things are sort of going that way. So it's breeding new open source software built on these bases. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about OpenGrep in that context.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who hasn't read the stories, but yeah, HashiCorp did the same thing with Terraform. These platforms kind of built on Semgrep built on open source, meaning their engine's open source. The community wrote a bunch of rules for the open source, but there's an actual company behind it who has a SaaS product and like a professional engine and a platform for you to have all your data in and all that kind of stuff. And so originally the engine and the rules were all open source, but in the past month or so, maybe it was December, they shifted um, to a business friendly closed source license. I think if you read between the lines, basically, a lot of different vendors were building on SemGrep open source and just kind of repackaging it. And SemGrep got fed up with it and was like, "Hey, if we're going to be paying for the development of this engine because they have paid engineers in house and paying to create these rules, like you can't just use our software to do that." But obviously, the community as a whole is pretty pissed. You just took a bunch of people's community contributions, open source contributions, and made it, your own IP. So OpenGrep just got announced this week, which is a bunch of vendors who came together to build basically off of a fork of Semgrep. So it's going to be an open source engine, open source rules. They have a bunch of improvements identified they want to build already. So it's very similar. It's basically the exact same thing as HashiCorp with Terraform and OpenTofu, which was the fork of Terraform when HashiCorp made that a business friendly quote unquote open source license. So yeah, interesting developments. I mean, it seems like there's a pretty big group behind OpenGrep, so we'll see how successful it is. But yeah, like you said, there's a people kind of fell in love with SemGrep, maybe took it a little for granted that it was free and open source, and things change. People decide to make money. So
Do you have any beat on how OpenTofu is doing compared to Terraform? Have you run into it at all?
yeah, I was gonna say the only stat I have is I've not talked to anyone actually using it. So I've heard a few like conferences. I've heard people chatting about it, but no one I've heard has made like the full cutover. So
Yeah. And that, I don't know how I feel about that. It's like because you can still use Semgrep open source, right? You just don't get all the rules and you don't get all the pro rules. Is that right?
yeah, or the Pro engine with their additional features. Yeah,
Yeah. And that, I mean, I think that's been sort of um the the MO of like a lot of these, like, so Terraform, you can still use Terraform open source. You can write your own providers, you can write all these things. So for OpenTofu not to take off is like, well, I'm getting enough out of the open source version. The enterprise things that I need that maybe OpenTofu offers, like, I don't really need anyway. And so in Terraform, I'm pot committed to this. Maybe I'll just pay for it, or get the company to pay for it. So it's interesting. I'm wondering if the price behind Semgrep to get those tools and what folks need in the enterprise is going to push more for OpenGrep. I'd be super interested to see how that all lands. But both,
yeah,
like, I find that whole thing interesting. I think you were talking too about we've seen a lot of these cutovers. We saw didn't you have like a lifetime license to something recently that became
Cloud
lifetime?
Guru.
Yeah.
Yeah, based on subsection 3, Article 5, 0 point font, we can revoke your lifetime license. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, lifetime of the product or whatever. So I find it man, it's like to me it's super interesting and also like really sad, because you get so excited about these companies and organizations, and they just become like the things that you despise about other companies. And the people that founded this were like, this is not where we saw these things going, but I guess we
Yeah.
sold out, so it's fine. um
Yeah. It's, I mean, it's such a debate between open source, like building on open source and trying to make a profit off of it. It's a tricky thing to do, and there's been a lot of examples of it done poorly and done well. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, it was interesting to see how much support that OpenGrep got like right off the bat. So I think more than OpenTofu got. So I think yeah, it'll be pretty interesting to see how much support there is and if people cut over from using Semgrep open source over to OpenGrep. So time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other piece of it too is that there's just like so many people that like the difference between the pro engine and um the fundamentals of the open source engine are so great with the pro rules that moving to something that has a similar function inside of an open source product is actually going to be really attractive versus Terraform where you had a similar structure, but you were in a position where like you only got enterprise features when you went to a paid version. Like the full product was more or less available, and you could just have a different backend. And maybe you're probably more in line with this than I am because most of the interaction that I've had with Terraform has been things I can do in both the open source version or the enterprise versions. But like in Semgrep, it's very clear to me what I can't do in the open source version.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think HashiCorp really wanted to create a platform around it and then kill off all the other platforms that were competing with it, and that's what they were going for with that license change. And you saw like companies like Spacelift who came out and supported OpenTofu, and because they were kind of like in the targets from HashiCorp with that move. So yeah, I think if I had to guess, I don't have any big inside knowledge, but all the companies supporting Open Grep, I'm guessing, have a financial interest in it succeeding based on the fact they probably integrate with it. I don't know that for certain, but so yeah, there's some competition there, which hopefully turns out to be a good thing, and we have a good open source tool that uh, delivers a lot of value. I mean, SemGrep has always delivered a lot of value for an open source tool, so yeah, hopefully that doesn't go away, but
Well, then next episode we'll have to have some experience with OpenGrep and some comparisons so we can successfully navigate all the functions of an AppSec program inside of open source or enterprise software.
yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good. Any final thoughts or words before we wrap up?
No, happy 2025.
Yes.
Another exciting year.
Yeah, happy 2025. It's a cold one this year, in on the East Coast, so um, definitely looking forward to some warmer weather.
Yes, for sure.
And on that note, thank you for joining us. Hope you have some new hobbies, breeding after this discussion on everything not DevSecOps. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.